Hey everyone, I'm DC Rutledge, and this is Two Hard Questions. In this episode, we'll be discussing the policy differences between two of the Democratic presidential primary frontrunners, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. There's been a lot of talk by media pundits about how similar the two are on policy, and they'll typically opt for personal or identity differentiations instead, like gender, demeanor, or tone. Unsurprisingly, this has caused many mainstream media viewers to believe that those are the only real differences between the two candidates. But when you take a closer look into each of their plans, it becomes clear that that's not necessarily the case. There are in fact some pretty big differences that are much more substantive than the media would like most people to realize. And that's what we'll be looking at in this episode of Two Hard Questions. First, let's talk about how Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren's policy proposals compare on some of the biggest issues in the 2020 campaign. Each candidate has addressed a lot of issues, and both have detailed plans to deal with them. So many that it would be near impossible to compare all of them in one show. So instead, we'll focus on three of the biggest: healthcare, education, and the climate crisis. Healthcare is one of the most important issues on the minds of American voters. Bernie Sanders has made his signature Medicare for All Act of 2019 one of the preeminent features of his campaign. It would create a national, single-payer, free at the point of service health insurance program administered by the Department of Health and Human Services. It would significantly expand current Medicare services to include mental health and substance abuse treatment, dental, hearing, and vision services, and in-home or community-based long-term care. It would also prohibit duplicative coverage from private insurers, relegating the health insurance industry to areas of non-essential elective procedures like plastic surgery. Finally, although taxes would increase progressively, the program would eliminate insurance premiums, co-payments, and deductibles, drastically reducing overall healthcare costs for average Americans. That's Bernie's plan. Elizabeth Warren was a co-sponsor of Bernie's Medicare for All bill and has repeatedly said that she is in favor of it.
Senator Warren, you signed on to Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All plan. It would put essentially everybody on Medicare and then eliminate private plans that offer similar coverage. Is that the plan or path that you would pursue as president?
So yes, I'm with Bernie on Medicare for All, and let me tell you why.
So it would seem there's nothing to compare, right? But when we look at her campaign website's section on healthcare, there are a couple notable omissions that stand out. First, although she claims to support Bernie's version of Medicare for All, there's no reference to his bill anywhere on the page. This seems odd, but let's give the benefit of the doubt that her campaign could just be wary of promoting another candidate's plans on their page. But then there's also the absence of the words single payer. Medicare for All, at least the way Bernie wrote the damn bill, is unequivocally a single-payer plan. That is the main feature that distinguishes it from other candidates' plans. So it's strange that Warren wouldn't include those words if Bernie's plan was indeed the one that she supports. Elizabeth Warren was a lawyer, a law professor, and is a current lawmaker, so she knows all too well the importance of precise wording and the effect on legislation when certain terms are left vague or omitted. So it's quite plausible that her plan is not in fact the same as Bernie's, even if she says so publicly. At this point, we can only speculate what the differences in their healthcare plans might be, but her non-specificity does cast doubt as to whether she is proposing a Medicare for All plan that would exclude private insurers the way Bernie's does. Next, let's compare their plans for education. Bernie's College for All and Warren's Affordable Higher Education for All would both beef up the use of Pell Grants to cover non-tuition costs, and both would increase funding for HBCUs and MSIs, making them essentially free. But that's where the plans diverge. Warren's plan would make 2- and 4-year public colleges tuition-free. Bernie's plan would do the same, but would make trade schools and apprenticeship programs free as well. Bernie would also double the funding for TRIO programs to assist an additional 1.5 million students from disadvantaged backgrounds to attend college. Then there's student debt cancellation. Warren's plan cancels up to $50,000 of an individual's student debt if their annual household income is less than $100,000. The amount of debt that could be canceled decreases by $1 for every 3 household dollars in excess of $100,000, up to $250,000, which is the upper limit of participation in her plan. According to Warren, this would completely cancel student debt for 75% of those who currently have it. That's nothing to sneeze at, for sure. But there's a weird statement in Warren's plan that says private student loan debt is also eligible for cancellation, which could be read to mean that her cancellation plan only applies to government student loans, not private. By comparison, Bernie's plan would cancel all existing student loan debt, public and private, period. Plus, it would cap the annual interest rate on all future student loans at 1.88%. Lastly, let's compare their plans to tackle the climate crisis. Now, due to the size of their plans, and in particular Bernie's, I could do an entire episode on comparing them, and I just might in the future, but for this episode, I'm mainly going to focus on the differences in scale. Bernie's Green New Deal plan is a massive $16.3 trillion in direct federal funding over 10 years. That's over $1.6 trillion per year. By comparison, Warren's Green Manufacturing Plan is $3 trillion over 10 years, or $300 billion per year. Warren's plan includes $400 billion for research and development, or roughly half of the $780 billion included in Bernie's plan. Bernie's plan includes $200 billion for the Green Climate Fund to assist other countries in transitioning towards sustainable energy production. Warren's foreign assistance is, again, half that at $100 billion. Bernie's plan would also institute a federal job guarantee program in addition to reinstating FDR's Civilian Conservation Corps in order to create 20 million good-paying union jobs to do the work required to combat the climate crisis. According to Warren's campaign, her plan would create just over 1 million jobs over 10 years. Both of their plans are attempting to achieve the same goal of averting the climate crisis. But as you can see, they aren't anywhere close to the same amount of public commitment. Now let's talk about why the differences in Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren's plans are significant. Pointing out the differences in candidates' policies is always important because it highlights the separate visions each candidate has for the future of our country. That's what primaries are supposed to be about. Expressing different ideas and allowing the voters to decide which candidate is best based on their stances on the issues. But the mainstream media tries very hard to convince voters to focus instead on personalities, identities, polling, or supposed electability. They do this because those are the areas of debate the media can most effectively manipulate and thus manufacture consent. By focusing on those areas, corporate media can prop up a corporate candidate who would otherwise be vulnerable to policy comparisons in the eyes of voters. That's why it's so important for policy comparisons to be made, because we want the candidate who best represents voters on the issues they care about to be the nominee for the general election. That's how we'll win. So here's the main takeaway. When comparing the plans of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, a couple common themes begin to emerge. First, Bernie's plans are almost always larger in scale and scope. They are comprehensive and work to completely transform problematic areas of our society, rather than just making incremental improvements around the edges. Second, Warren's plans are almost always dependent on a traditional market-centric approach. Warren emphasizes subsidies to cover costs, whereas Bernie emphasizes grants for public purpose objectives. Bernie aims to compel industry with increased taxes and penalties and legal recourse, whereas Warren wants to incentivize industry with tax credits and government contracts. It basically comes down to reformation versus transformation, incrementalism versus mobilization, regulation versus revolution. The incremental market-based policies of the past 40 years are what have led us to the crises we now face. And we can't roll the dice hoping that market-based policies alone will solve them. In a time when people's lives literally hang in the balance due to a lack of health care, when people's futures are in jeopardy due to a lack of education and mounting student debt, and when the existential crisis of climate change threatens the health and habitability of the entire planet, we cannot afford to come up short with our solutions. This may be our only shot. We must be bold, we must think big, and we must act now. Thanks for watching this edition of Two Hard Questions. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share it with your friends. And as always, please subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can catch every episode. Until next time, peace.